turbulent, but at its depth, it is peaceful and serene and stable. And so it's just a matter of whether mind meets with those outer conditions or not.
아니 덴디기 노니다 다다 나소기 니동데 간디 툴레데 요르세네 쟁기 요르베게 다다디 발람다오 디기 나로라다 니 데반다오.
And so for us, of these two situations, of the deeper stability and the surface level of disturbance, we are abiding in that surface level of the waves, of that movement and turbulence.
아니 다데나 인치페디 지코페 샘게랑 인데 샤바다 자체바데 인데바이나 양 아니 지 다다 나솔 자충충 차이데 간데시니 차바레 세트디가라 오데 데네 나소다지 다든즈밤 야나 다 지녀몽도 착 업지고니 아니 자체모데야 충충데다 같이 즈바지기 즈바다 착비고니다 자충충 차바레다.
And then, so just as we said, like the real nature, the real root or nature of mind is peaceful and vast and open. And so if that's the case, then how is it that we became so closed off? Because our minds are closed off and small and not vast like the ocean, like that example. And so then we were explaining about how grasping and how the afflictive mental state of attachment cause through that grasping and through that grasping attachment, then that mind, which is in its nature vast and open, becomes closed off and restricted. And so that's what caused, that grasping is what causes, as we said before, everything fits in the ocean. It causes not fit in our mind. And so first, the root of that grasping is self-grasping, grasping at me. And then once we have that me, then we have a sense of my, like my possessions, my friends, so that type of me and my. And then once you have me and my, then you have the separation into me and mine versus other, something that's other than me or mine. And that's at that point when things no longer fit, when what we said, where the nature of mind, where everything fits, once we have that holistic separation of self versus other, things no longer fit.
아니 델 땡지다 나서 니데 니 추다 뱀 뭐뭐 야추고랬다 아니 제 니 생긴다고 드라 생긴다고 되네 랑수 생긴다고 옌수 생긴 되네 배 뭐보다 이해한다고 되니 파 로야 된데스.
And once we have that as our foundation, then we have a sense of self and other, friend and enemy, and many other dualistic concepts come from that source.
나서 안데 나진다 차바델랑에 니 시바이 착세 생애지다 인직세세지 니 아니 착비게 세바다 저거디 착바데레다 지 메이저 아니 타 고사 똥니다 가리나다 착바데제 아니 델 소수게 다다 가사 차데라 되니 착세세 아니 다디그 문퉁수 용에 대해서라더니 인직세세 다고 따네 대체 용마지거지니 까야게 차지 다 된데 드비 차지다 대 문퉁수데 까야게 차지 니들 차바 니거니 아니 나서 참아 다지 요다다 생자다 강한데 몽보지 다 디니 용한다고 차기어레스.
And so then from there, I moved on to discuss how there are two kind of aspects to our grasping, to our attachment. And so we have an attachment which is based in desire for attaining things. And then we have another attachment which is based in fear. And so our attachment, which is based in our desire, comes from anything that we like and that we want to bring in, that we want to accomplish. So that can encompass many things, such as having a good name or a good reputation, wealth, status and position, fame, any of these kind of things that we think of as something good or something that we want to accomplish or gain for ourselves. That's what we call attachment through desire or desirous attachment. And then we have another kind of attachment that we could call like fearful attachment, or attachment, that works through the lens of fear. And that is when anything is actually contrary to those wishes that we have, anything which is opposing those. And so we have this fear which leads us to want to stop anything from coming at us, anything that opposes those things from coming at us, and to kind of refute or push away any of those contrarian forces. And so that is another type of desire. So we have these two types: the desire or attachment, which works through desire, and attachment which works through fear. And those two types of attachment are the source of all of our difficulties and fighting and problematic situations.
아니 다 댕아서 예 라고 등을 zonche 다 댕아서 다 데라 아니 당아서 강한 참아드니 용구 여바 데이터 하고 잡으래 아니 다 데라 가르그 팽그레스 헤드갈라 아니 람르시에 람란도고 요레스.
And so that was the foundation. We've understood then that all of our problems come from that. Then what can we do to be of benefit to that? What can we do to help that situation? And so that's when we get into actually having a path to work with.
다 람란도도 anytime 아서 배 잠소라 다리 닌 세반다 고체니 때 땡삽살라 만로니 다 강게 데가서 용고대야 당제니 아니 마 가세 땡삽살란 로야 다 데딘 로비게더니 르반다 호텔 람세 인게 당아서 샘게 코랑 제 특바세네 야찌난다 땡삽살니 마찌난다 같이다 데라다 람세 아니 데리세기요레스.
And so when we talk about a path, when we were talking about those two aspects of the ocean, we're working on going from that surface level of the ocean, that disturbed state, into those calm depths. And we're talking, when we talk about that, we're actually talking about, our mind. And so we're talking about a stage of progress of our mind, which takes us from that disturbed state into that calm, serene, and profound deep state. And so we can think of that in two ways. We can think of that either in levels of moving upwards in the development of our mind, or moving downwards in terms of going from this coarser, more disturbed state into a deeper and more profound state. And so that progress that we make is what we refer to as, or the stages of progress is what we call the path.
다 근데 손잔다 이오데야 데다리디 책 발업로 다 이오 댕인데 다 가르기 요래 아니 대와다 동아 다 베네다다 드나시바 나인진 야다 디니 람는 도난데기도 아니 대와다 동아게 아니 나소게 샘 발업데 이오데기 요래 스페잖아.
And so what is the movement at the top of the ocean that we were talking about? That movement is the movement of happiness and suffering, bringing it back to the matter at hand, to this present text. And so just like those waves of the ocean are stirring about, we're stirring about in this happiness and suffering.
다 요와 데라야 니 요르다 다 니 가리 요르시디 깽기 요와 찌당 깽기 요와 찌당 발업 요와 찌니 요레 깽베나 롱기 자발라 땡치니 쳇딩고 찌타야다 디니 발업 촉치니 발업 비자 땅치니 촉바치 닌가오치
And in that ocean, we can also talk about two types of movement. One, which is the movement that is caused by outer conditions, such as in the ocean, the sense of the wind giving rise to the wave in the first place. And then the second level is when one wave crashes into the other wave and reinforces or empowers or strengthens the power of the second wave. And so we talk about two levels of movement on that discussion.
Then songbanta jing yoba say data penang so tatanda ureta jik ne yang la ani dige jik ya kasere ne yang la pamjo thula ya kanga chong ani jik ta nga so je pamjo ta karina ta thamji thuni je kanga ji chi yo ni theungdo de de long jump so yowanda uchi.
And so when we talk about the first type, which is like the wind blowing the water, we call that the movement caused by an outer condition. And so in our present circumstance, that is the outer condition of this massive illness, and as well as the kind of the economic impacts of that, which are these outer circumstances which cause that movement. And so just like the wind causes movement on the surface of the ocean.
아니, 다 내가 나긴 게 직다 소소가 빼나. Magasala, 아니 콩토 해당 라소바 유야다. 다 대나기에 빼나 양 가살한다 차라서 다 같이 나소라 다 가독니 세지오 말에 다 대그 요동데 대가랑래 코 가독이 요 강인 받데 아니 롱구 요반다고 지제제 다 나소 그 디칼랑 야요 말다 다 체코랑 요반다고 제디 아니 난 생고 똑기고니 아니 요그레스 다코 난 생되게 체 요라 마티바 양 댕에 다 히드네 디마시야고 베나 다다드나디 지데세도 나와 달랑 생이다오지 가세디 파기 요데기 젠점지 제제 아니 지마데라타 나와 생인데 랑게 셈지지 랑게 셈라드니 제 요르그 나바샤 제 셈그 나바샤체니 아니 디니가 바랄라더니 디 랑게 셈가 랑라 투파타 랑게 셈라 랑라 동야 세야 또비야 다 가세레 페히야 뭐야 다 드라마다 차탄데 소시글로라 텐다우지 샤티니 데 소시 셈데 냐 좀바데 소시레 디니가 발더니 나서 빼 흉제모 몽보지야 zo야데 다 체코랑게 되네 와라게 요 데버존다고치 어딘데스 차비요레
And so that means that, our present situation when we were talking about, disturbances of the mind or difficulties caused by sickness and economic stuff, that means that it's caused by some outer condition. And that means that there's some outer object of our perception which is causing an inner disturbance. And so it's the same situation if we talk about how we become angry at, someone or some situation that we don't like, or we become desirous of some object that we do like, or some person, something, anything. And so those are those two sides of like and dislike, or happiness and suffering. And that's how that movement of mind comes about. And that means that they come about through the condition of meeting with some object, some outer object. And so that's just like how the wave is moved by the wind. And so, but we don't only consider it in that way. That's not the only way that we have an inner disturbance, not only due to outer conditions. And so there's the second type, which is the way that one wave can actually cause a disturbance of a second wave, or can reinforce the second wave, or cause the second wave, and so forth. And that is that movement of mind itself. And without necessarily directly coming into contact with, or not in a direct relationship with the external object. And that's when we were talking about that discussion above, where we used the term appearances arising as enemies. And what that meant, and what that discussion was in reference to, was when you did first have some situation with a person, like some kind of external situation or something, but then later that left this mental impression that you have an appearance of that situation or that person in your mind. And in your mind, that kind of separates it into two, where you confuse the thing that's actually just appearing in your mind as being the actual object which is outside, which caused that appearance in your mind. And so you consider that person or situation in your mind as if it's actually them, and it's actually just your mind, one aspect of your mind, acting as you, the judger or the fighter or the angry person, the person who's crying, fighting, being angry, wanting to get back at them, wanting to kill at them or whatever. And the thing that you're trying to get at is actually just another part of your mind. It's the appearance of that object in your mind. And so you actually are just fighting with yourself. And you're having this two aspects of your own mind, and you're just like fighting with yourself. And so there are lots of problems, lots of difficulties that we create in our mind in that way. And that is the example going back to, or an example of what I was meaning when I said that there was a second type of movement in the ocean, which was the wave, the water causing movement within the water. That is a wave causing further movements of other waves, or that one wave reinforcing movement of other waves. So we can create that also in our own mind.
And then kasi rang la ani kasi semba la shani di da nawa da nangyo ni bote norni troni ani je de zamjing aso ma nyung tang thoba ina yang pe pinto chimbo yores pe ne jamso khorang la pe long zam mai ba che khorang ge yawa den jamdo na long ge den ni ba de pe darong shuk chung chung cha gres.
And so if one thing that I was talking about then is that, we confuse something which is merely an appearance in our own mind, something which is our own perception, for being the actual object of that perception, meaning the actual external person in a situation. We think that we're actually getting at them, actually fighting with them, but actually all it is just an appearance in your mind. And so even if we can just understand that situation, that we're not actually getting at them, we're not actually fighting with them, we're just fighting with ourselves. And if we can minimize that level of activity in our mind, that's of really great benefit. Just like if the waves in the ocean didn't reinforce the other waves, then just the wind alone doesn't have that much power.
Lugares nge tari shebai kasi de be nangyo nga da ure wa ta de nga sacha kawalan do yo na mishi ni khok do na mishi khala sa de na mishi kasi de chibo tang chi de na mishi kasi de tada kanya ha ko yo mare ina ya chno so da wo chi ki seng no la ba ha le ga kanga chmo yo di yo re ti di me de na ba sha de ti ni be de luga cha yo re ta tse jo sa
And so I gave an example of me doing some harm to you before. And so when you're actually getting upset and thinking about that situation, you actually have no idea what I'm doing at that time. You have no idea where I am. You don't know. I could be asleep. I could be eating dinner. I could be having a lot of fun. You have no idea, but you have no idea what I'm doing or where I am. But in your mind, you're sitting there, fighting with me. And all you're fighting with is actually, what you think is me, which is just another part of your mind. It's just an appearance of me in your mind. It's not getting at me. You're just sitting there fighting with yourself.
La so anta tadangin dwala ya chi do lam che sedu ndi da sem de ten sabram ja che ta ya ti ge ramba da bote la lam si yor ti lam je ramba ani di lam je ramba te ran do ber che ba la ani chipo da dobo nin rosa de kenza da wo chi so ya yores namju nga so mo ge te so yo ma de nge tari she ba na ji de ko che ndorian da wo che linka so ndo ta tren chipo tang sa yang sa ni yen ba ta go so ndo tendes cha yor ba te di nu la ta da tendes mares.
And so now getting back to the title of taking happiness and suffering as the path, then as a path means that we are using them as a way to bring our mind, to make our mind more vast or to make it more profound. And so these are stages of a path of development in that way. And so in order to do that, what we use these happiness and suffering is we actually use happiness and suffering as steps, as rungs of our ladder of progression, as steps in our staircase to our further progression. And so we don't normally do that. What we normally do is we try to cast away suffering, and we try to, we consider, Khen Rinpoche gave an example before of that happiness is just like a park. It's just like something that we pleasantly enjoy while it's here, but we don't try and use it for anything. We just enjoy it while it's here, leave it, and then try and get more of it later, but we don't use it for anything.
Hola, so, aninda lam doya la ta dopochi. Ta chidok ni ki noni ya ta dopo de kandris chini lam den chegre se na di sabchi nona doa la. Donga la ta chi de mende bi lo ga, donga den jonga la gawa chi gawi lo ches. Di namba ni cheni.
And so when we first talked about then these two aspects of using happiness and suffering. First, we worked with suffering, how to use suffering as a path, how to take it on the path. And so there were two outline points, two main points being made here. And the first one was dropping the attitude of being entirely unwilling to suffer. And the second was cultivating the attitude of being joyful when suffering arises.
And this song that Tambo Dinola Ani Karsigedusene, Chirong la Dumala Magabaga Lot Chemo Maho as the Dumare Kadin and the government they Tohure Tengal government within somebody who came on Maji as this here.
And so the first one means that you shouldn't always be trying to avoid suffering. You shouldn't be, having this strong grasping that you need to avoid suffering or that you don't like suffering, because that grasping itself causes suffering. And so you shouldn't be doing that.
Benanta Dijig Magava Chena, they so Kale Chamboda with Union Dore. Pe Chada with Jana, any Muji Pando the Mugdi Tama, Zubu Tama Yaravala. India said the
shadow.
Oh, shadow. That the co Mugavache dena. Co Pache di Yam the road there, that Kasing as Mugavache Gorda. We didn't get call Kaya Nameji Yogana Kokanga Yomares. Tell Mugavache, Tanang Chena, Tini, Kasere Kalekares, Tena Yang so Duman de Tari Chagno, the long days, Jenshuana Kitchen, as Yam the road the Yores. And
so one aspect of this is that if we continue, having a distaste for or a mind which wishes to avoid and, think of suffering as something really bad, then that actually causes a lot of difficulty for us. That's actually a difficult thing to carry around. It's just like if you didn't like your own shadow, or if you were fearful of your own shadow, that shadow is with you all the time. And it's something you're constantly carrying with you, that kind of fear or that distaste for that. And so, suffering's just like that. It's something that, or, difficult situations are like that too. It's just like, the wind in the first example of the wind in the ocean. There's always something which is always there. And if we're constantly trying to avoid that and constantly disliking that, then that's something that we're always having to, struggle with. It's something that's always causing us trouble. Oh, sorry. But if we can just drop that distaste for that, if we can drop that, avoid that mind which wishes to avoid that or which has a distaste for that, then that is, no longer causing us trouble.
And Jaga Lodrak Tignanola, pretty Pomoni Tupashocha. Then Tupasho, any dog again, Yake, Tangin, Cheni, Cartin, and Tupasho is La Dugala. Any Puina Pomoni Jagilan, Jim Senda with the Coron Tower, the Yangal Takidusila. Any Tower, who Ngal Takidusi. Any the young that Kazi didn't just so huge or that. Coron Tower, the Yangalta, the Dusi. Any that put the Kase, young Moran Tower in Alta, the says, Maricarina, she says. Our then the Kazitawa Kanda Hako do say, the Chirong in the part, I thought the Yawashi Shimason. Kachin Korani, take it to the part because I was Mendo. That was no. That take part that take it to Tadi, that take Pansanjel nurging into Pashodua. Did call the
So there's a story here of, there was this boy and a girl at a school in India that were fighting, and they got in a fight, and then the teacher had to come over and figure out what was going on. So the teacher said, "Why are you fighting?" And the boy said about the girl, "She's always staring at me." And so the teacher said, "How do you know she's always staring at you if you're not staring at her?" Anyway, the point is that they were getting upset just because one was looking at the other.
The Chagi or and then the song did our stitch. And it did color the Balatan, so pay Doman de Young, Shivala song in it, Domala Magava Magis. Juya Yona, but you shows. Juya Mena, yo hoes. Penadang so de Kanga Karina Reta. Karina, Tambo Kanga, the so Mebatanga Chitanga so Kejahi, Yakochi, Pekate Shivazus, Zotugudan Tepa Zufos, sang the Domaje de Gomares, Zotugumadona, Anekaze Pa Yokos, then I could Kanga the Junchedores, teaching the Domal Magaga Chegue Yomares.
And so, in terms of that, then Shantideva advises us and tells us that we don't need to have any dislike for adverse circumstances or difficulties. And his reason is that he says that if there's some way to fix that difficult situation, then you should fix it. And if there is a way to fix it and you can apply yourself at fixing it, then there's no longer any reason to have a distaste for or a resistance toward some kind of difficult circumstance. And alternately, if there is no way to fix the situation, then you just need to drop it and not be worried about it anymore and just accept that it's not fixable. And so that's the same with any kind of difficult circumstance that we could be in. If there's a way to solve that, then you should, if let's say you can solve it through talking it out, then you should talk it out. And you should speak, calmly and peacefully and work it out. And there's no reason to be upset about it if you know that you can work your way through it. And alternately, if there's no way to work through it and no way to fix the situation, then you just need to drop it. You need to realize that it's not something you can fix and drop it, and then not allow it to harm your mind. So in either instance, there's no reason to have any kind of aversion to or resistance to or displeasure with unfortunate or difficult circumstances.
Ani that dena yinge ta o de soni mambu thang ta nga so duhan la ten chi ni duhan de kanga ra mare tele teni yonde sem nang yonde chi ya yore dena yinge pe chi ta o de nge ma hye gi di duhan khorang la ten chi ni pe na de la yang nga so la chi phen to sa chi ni mambu ya phen to re de so o ma gin thang re ni nge dena ma hye gi.
And so also later in the text it's going to be a discussion that suffering isn't, adverse circumstances or suffering isn't just, shouldn't be just seen as adversity. It should also, it'll come about later in the text where as a result of such circumstances, there are many times that can, going through that or working with that can generate a lot of wholesome, positive qualities within our minds. And so there are many such examples and methods that are going to be discussed later in the text, which I'll talk about when we get there.
That's so and nga do de hye that's do nga so di dema niba no tena ta niba ani ta dunga jongwa la gawa che ba se de le shadows.
And so we were getting to the point where we were talking about cultivating the attitude of being joyful when suffering arises.
Oh, la so ani di niba che so pe cha la zainanas.
So you should look at the text. On my PDF, I downloaded the PDF from Lotsawa House, and it's page 3, the top of page 3.
Niba donga la lamje trositi ni gawa gongo te yang donga kanjong rang loi niba dan tempe gejong re da seji mena na jar tangki da dena donga la tene pheyan da dan da ta thop de yedo hiba cham hi mang de samjang se namka dan saji ba ren hiba ta song ni guban rao kaos.
Seeing suffering as an ally to help us on the path, we must learn to develop a sense of joy when it arises. Yet whenever suffering strikes, unless we have some kind of spiritual practice to bring to it, one which matches the capacity of our mind, no matter how many times we may say to ourselves, well, as long as I've got roughly the right method, I'll be able to use suffering and obtain such and such a benefit, it's highly unlikely that we'll succeed. We'll be as far from our goal, as the saying goes, as the earth is from the sky. Therefore, use suffering as the basis for the following practices.
Lam chil majana ta chana nga so thabyo se labdi phentho maris
Thup
ta thabda thab khi ba se je mare
yo
thab khi da dena ta thabyo yore se labdi phentho maris.
So we have to apply this to a real path of practice. Otherwise, just saying that we have some method isn't very helpful.
Aninda di nanola ma tabla jatong delata ramba dunda which is yando. Rebel. And here ramba dunding ma dini rede in the mashuyagis.
And so in terms of the way that we actually apply these methods, there are 7 stages given here. So I'm going to go through those one by one.
Dina reche Dumala tini ngenjong samba jawana. Jesi wame den kwan chamba tesi de tabe dungan jongwan muba hi jongwan mainje kobi ngansa te tabe ino nyamba ta rehi dendo na tibi dungan nyetse yang de tabe zobar kana ngendi dungan ta chemu de chema on kwan tinta mebi dungan je janso ino nyamde chowa chite yi tharba la choba osta digi kar sigo se de dungan la tene ya ngenjong samba te. And
so first we get into using suffering to train in renunciation. Sometimes then, use your suffering in order to train your mind in renunciation. Say to yourself, as long as I wander, powerless and without any freedom in samsara, this kind of suffering is not something unjust or unwarranted. It's simply the very nature of samsara. At times, develop a deep sense of revulsion by thinking, if it's already so hard for me to bear with even the little suffering and pain of the happy realms, then what about the suffering of the lower realms? Samsara is indeed an ocean of suffering, fathomless and without any end. Then turn your mind towards liberation and enlightenment.
Ani ta dana nginjong se de kar sikor se na kanga den thongje ani kanga le thabi thandug lo je batela nginjong se de sikyor.
And so what is meant by renunciation is that we see some difficulty, and then we have a sense in our mind of wishing to be freed from that difficulty. And that's what's meant by renunciation.
Ani pe nga so ni kam do sam tang ba yin ta nga so din zambleng mu de so yang ji mongbo ji ya ta yang make do ji dang yores. Oh ta ka nga de je yung ku do was. Ta di set up ji some tango who was ta mongba kande che go sare sambachi ta da me chi chung chomi leba no yang lap sares ko te yon den ji res.
And so this is a real, a quality of mind. Like, for example, in our current circumstance, people are sitting there with very open eyes to this situation. And they are seeing and really recognizing that even this kind of situation that we're experiencing now can even happen to us. Like before, we didn't think that would happen to us. So they think this can also happen to us. So now we're thinking, people are actually thinking of all the ways that we can prevent this from happening again in the future. And so that's a real quality, isn't it? That's a real quality of mind, a real wholesome or positive quality that can be developed.
And nga so me chama sam de here ta nga so sitchila rego me nga so mai matha pa chiyam me singin do. Then the bed the hali ni de yours. Ta ndiji law ani chijin de me ba de chadi ta yiji samno din khobu do was. Ko jakab so ina o tan ro tong ji su ji je na ma to kali jin thong do was.
And so in the past, we were all thinking that we don't need to place our hopes in anyone, that we can take care of ourselves, And now everyone is here, really helpless. We can't actually do anything about anything. And so every individual country and everyone is kind of considering and reconsidering like their situation and how they can actually do something meaningful now.
And then getting some pounds on that is taking us so long that Jima Yabuda with Chundukala, Naso had double Jiban double Karina, Chiki Zona Matotan, the chair and do some Sandao. And they are Chaki or us.
And even in the minds of individuals thinking on a real individual level, then, people are starting to recognize that these kind of situations can even happen to them so that they need to make further preparations, whether that's in terms of, saving more money or whatever kind of preparations that they can, work towards for, seeing that this is actually something that could happen to them.
And in the Nangbaji Mayina, that is Shivana Yinchita. Chug balab yo devate tongu yorda. Tong jini dilima tang sabalan royak. Tako samo tang checheni, di tangbon in the so name sing so gom checheni, then mama hakwachi gom chini, and then Ramba in the co gom japchini, di kangan den tayak, ko tapita de yore. Te sonzanta kangan de laundukala o ta tini tawaji chegodu sambi. And ninjong logi laungres.
And so then, as a Buddhist, then, we see the waves of the ocean. We see that disturbance, that wave of the ocean. And so we are trying to, contemplate that we want to take ourselves into the depths. We want to take ourselves from that surface level into the depths. And so we consider that and develop this sense of renunciation, that wish to be freed from that level of disturbance. And so then we apply ourselves in meditation through developing that renunciation. Then we take that sense of renunciation and use that to bring us into those deeper stages of meditation. And so that is then the process of generating or gaining renunciation.
Ani da pening as American rawchine ta chi mongbo chi ge ta lujung da semjung sing de hlong do. And this in the course chi lujung lula phantu semjung sen phantu jeni chi jang jeni kali ma ji shide zoya ge sam tang de do. Oda di kangan the so rabu donne che che de rabu yoba hakko che ani daily sem de hiwa do byala ani phantu de yor ta telang in jongsa.
And so many people in America are interested in, exercise, both in terms of their physical exercise, also in terms of, kind of mental health. And, the literal word Khen Rinpoche said was mental exercise, but I think we're talking in terms of mental health. And so, they're trying to work with their bodies in order to benefit their bodies and work with their minds in order to benefit their minds. So they're trying to accomplish some kind of level of comfort and peace. And so, and they're working with that in order so that they can be kind of prepared for, that their mind can be prepared for situations, even the types of situations that we find ourselves in now. So that mind of renunciation is, seeing a problem and then thinking of gaining that desire, that wish to overcome or to be freed from that problem.
Ani da koso da bujin da ngamati so hakoche ni gom nyamne ndo this jeni yore en da de kanga je la und koso de pe khangba no la de jin sen da ha jang ge pe denja cha jin da ro nyamne je ko khron ra ne ji muni chi kanga de so ge da nang la zan ni ji yong go ma tha ba de pe mo do wa pe ko ji da chen da ko pe gom cha jin da pe shu ji ni de ge de yang
Chirangi Loma.
Oh, that Loma Ramarella. She ding up a New York, so Leka leading it. Did Mambunga Tapaski the Yoba?
Less. So I'm in contact with, quite a few people, particularly Tibetans who have trained in some of these practices and exercises and developed this renunciation. And, when this situation arose for them, this situation of self-isolation and so forth, then they really saw this as a real opportunity to take their practice even deeper. That through seeing the difficulties in the world, that drove them to have even further, commitment to their practice. And they were really able to stay very peacefully without being disturbed by these outer circumstances, but actually as an opportunity for them to develop themselves even more and are really able to apply themselves in meditation.
And Mahon big Kanga de so young, by the job to me the Jumbaina, oh, that they do Kanga del Tanchini, Naladi, Munjibi dang the tops on Senatary Donga de la Kanga de la Yanko, Governor, da Cassere, Governor Gomdo, or teaching the Lukuyor.
So what's being discussed here is like, for example, like this current difficult situation that we're in right now. If we use that as a way to generate renunciation, and through that renunciation, we develop ourselves to the point where we are able to act as a source of refuge for ourselves, that we can protect ourselves from these types of situations in the future, then when we look back upon this difficult situation that we're going through right now, we will be able to see that suffering, that difficult circumstance as something, we will actually be able to feel a sense of appreciation or almost joy that we went through that situation. And that's the perspective from which this is talking about.
Hola, so taring di Kembo
and so I told the story this morning of Khenpo Wangchu Sonam, who was one of my teachers in the monastery in India, and he had cancer in his leg and had to have his leg amputated. And so it was, as a result of the fact that his leg was amputated, that he was, really gained renunciation and really applied himself diligently in his meditative practice and attained high levels of realization. And so, he said to Khen Rinpoche went and received teachings from him. And he said, that if it wasn't for the fact that I got, for the kindness, he said the actual kindness of my leg, actually, if it wasn't, he had gratitude that he had lost his leg, because he said if it wasn't for that, he would have just been wandering around the world and wouldn't have really applied himself and wouldn't have developed himself in meditation. And it was due to really the kindness, the real fortunate circumstance, that he was able to really feel that it was fortunate that he lost his leg, that it was due to that he was able to develop himself in that way.
So, yeah, di tata dung no ne ta tangbo de degas hegindas.
And so of those first 7 points, that was the first one. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Aninda niba jamlo jamwa singende data cherab jumar jipande taba yangda yangde nyemba la malabi japs jabana konchusan kona yimbi ijante kona la temba zayi desam kela papya tamar majao nyamde ngibartini jamro gomba wos.
And so the second is using suffering to train in refuge. So saying to yourself, life after life, again and again, we are continuously plagued by these kinds of fears. And the one and only protection that can never fail us is the precious guide, the Buddha, the precious Sangha, the Dharma, and the precious companions on the way, the Sangha, the 3 jewels. So it is on them that I must rely entirely. Whatever happens, I will never renounce them. Let this become a firm conviction and train in the practice of taking refuge.
So, that deal, Kase got that pe donga jibala tenjeni, te Jobia tondala, and Jobs killer, Tam Javachila, Jamdo se, the Sigata, Penangasota, Kangan Jipanda with Dilly, Jobi tondala, and Jobson Roba killing the Tam Jasing it.
And so the meaning of taking refuge means that, experiencing some kind of fear or some kind of suffering. And then in order to be protected from that fear, if we accept someone as a source of refuge and make a commitment towards that, then that's kind of the nature of refuge. Like, for example, if we're in this current situation with coronavirus and we seek out some way to be protected from that, but we, in addition with that, we accept that thing as our source of refuge and make a commitment to that, that would be taking refuge, on the basis of this current situation.
And in the Naso Tata Digida Jamdo said, Nambi Jamdo said, Kandachil Kogur Sena, and Pagi da Doma Casereta, Doman de that's Zoki Tangeng, Jalanda Masonieta, Casere Somji Yachi, and it tender what Gileta. That Dungan de Revala, Secuya, that Jalanda was Segomareta, Pachechi Dungan Secuya, Gitaka, Niebo Som dela, and in the Koju Som Siyakiore, Jetan or a Trijiakiores.
And so what we mean by refuge in Buddhist refuge and these objects of refuge or sources of refuge are that we have kind of like 3 things which are like remedies to overcome our suffering, to eliminate our suffering, to cure us of the disease of suffering.
I'll
give you an example.
And the any the shiver jepala and churons of tambo nganda de la tungo doa. Telegendunse, Nala Gendunse. And then Nala ten dividend pento maringa merevata. And then ye get tapped it tank doa. Churons on a dridri yoris, tela lamse. That day tambo zongen de la any sanjise. That this some de tena ane dunga de so pangji yobata tisan matena dunga de pang mataba indi da dunga pangji ki chala da wuji lo ko yoreste.
And so, for example, I'm explaining all these things which are methods for transforming or for overcoming suffering, right? And so in order for you all to understand this, you have to rely upon some teacher like me. And so I become like the Sangha in this situation. And then just relying upon me isn't helpful. You also need these methods, which I'm explaining to you. And so those methods are the path, which is the Dharma. And then the person who originally created this Dharma, who originally taught this path, is the Buddha. And so if we rely upon these three things or three factors, then we are able to overcome suffering. We are able to abandon suffering. And without relying upon them, we won't be able to utterly or completely eliminate suffering.
Tapenan di Buddha sanji se dengede tama ngama ngasota ngaso na yinjire kanza chetang bachi rangju bachi. Ane korange da kale chi donga pangthap dewa druptap tiso sama shi ni ma tenja juchi. Tendeji la sanji se.
And so, for example, the Buddha originally in the beginning was a person like us, ordinary person, who, worked to figure out how to abandon suffering and how to accomplish happiness. And then after knowing that, after really realizing that for himself, then he taught it to others.
Ane ta konge sheba de jisen rangchini ngarange yang tenda wunda chita kase ngarange lalen tachi ngarang na pen tuni ene lanan jogji metela gendun se.
And so then those who followed after the teachings of the Buddha and who put them into practice and gained some positive results from that are who are referred to as the Sangha.
Ta ti tab kang badela ane lam am chuse.
And then the actual method that they use, the method that is taught, is what's called the path or the Dharma.
And then there's something that donga jamenda with the uni da with the sayagos and a chuti yagos. That choose and that top dating and then I hear the hinder yen the redas. The ningas on trudon the region in Trukuduas. He in the richer Mantoya legan the rich jagor that's top ten de tela choose. That we need jamwe the teremadoya lap lang at the little maris donga theatre.
And so the one of those which is actually directly able to protect us from suffering is the Dharma. It's the methods themselves. Like, for example, I explained to you, this is the real nature, the real fundamental state of your mind. This is how that state of mind becomes confused or mistaken. And this is the way to, rid yourself of those mistakes. These are the methods or the actions that you can take to overcome those mistakes. And so those are the real, those methods, those teachings and methods are the things that actually will protect you or help you to overcome suffering or abandon suffering. Otherwise, there's not any person who can just pull you out of suffering by the hand. So I've got to tell you a little story here.
And Pagi di Varanasi, that thing sound the walk the Yaman nang the Kedwala, it's Pachimodua. And Nimajita, Naso Purgan, Toron Lord Chichu, Varanasi, and then I love Jikona, Manima Dulin Nankadua. And the rigid Nansa Dwala, the Ne Shastri Sida, Nasa Kejuchi, Repachi, and it quantity the Nanyam the Deus. And it also Nima Duna de Song Chechini, Rotsadikala, and it also go Loma the data, what is Lobrat and the Lomati, Muchi. And it called Shankal Juchin and go on the day, don't come with the race. And it met so some the taco no sound of tragedy, Drumland Rochi, Tati Kejana Hatred. Kukana Carla was in did we get the knee, Cassere. Did we tap the Namanga Caricini dinning the materials, a quality pembora chomendo. Then it go shing the donkey with it is.
The checky anchi Nyamla mix it out Chicarella.
De won't jung up.
Shinegi.
The shin, the Tata Jiggerala won't jung up. That's it. Won't jung up a chamber that the Jaga that the number charging Peshuke.
Hakos. And so the story goes that they're in Varanasi. This is where we have the biggest exile Tibetan university is in Varanasi, and the students there were training with this one Indian tradition of Buddhism where they are very strong in the practice of following the breath, following the inhalation and exhalation of the breath. And my old translator Shastri, he was a student there at the time. He was there, and so they were practicing this for 7 days, like a meditation retreat for 7 days. And at the end of the 7 days, they all exited, the retreat, the practice. And one Tibetan guy had his arms wrapped around a tree and was hitting his head on the tree and crying. And everyone thought, oh man, he's really lost it. Like they thought, he'd actually gone crazy in the retreat. And so they went over to him to see what he was doing, see if he was okay. And he said, why didn't anyone ever teach me this before? So it seemed he got some real benefit from the practice,
That day, Lama top taking
So this is an example that the path or the methods then can have, directly can protect you from suffering.
And then this changing down also Taribe Gangan, the Legil Dangeni, top the Legil. And it top the rat in a mong big Gangan to the job Tabaino. Also that the Unichi da Tatantino here Yatita, Jamdo Jama Seta Tere.
And so, relying upon, because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, we come here together and we learn these methods. And then if we use those methods to develop ourselves to the point where we're able to protect ourselves, to really be a source of refuge or protection for ourselves from future unfortunate circumstances, future adversities, then, that's what's meant by refuge, actually. Then that is.
Then I get that the thing number is and then I get on la pet and dig Mong big Gangan and the Jap Tungi Karachona day and Castle go Jap Chadir of us.
So that's the Buddhist sense of refuge. But, anything that you could do, which is going to act as a source of, protecting you from future troubles is a level of refuge or taking refuge, practice of refuge.
And that's not so Namada was in a danga sola, betting sound that Sandik Bala Lashi, which use. That Karachonga in an associating man that the nigga Matapachi, your Marisan, man, a Japjak Yoris. That other party dig a young lama he by the Ludu, and he Kalakobdoas.
And so, like in the past, for example, we have so many like skillful, doctors and scientists and so forth these days. And so we think, we get into the state of mind where we think that, there's nothing that won't just be treated by medicine or won't be figured out by scientists. But we're in a situation where we're not, they're not finding solutions. They're actually being defeated or overwhelmed by the situation.
So that's somebody
and so the third is using suffering to overcome arrogance.
Rangla Wang making that the Dungaji Ewam in Mandibi Sola 10 days, Litung Yong be double Naja, Yen Chitty long such a saos.
As I explained before, as long as we're in samsara, we are never independent or truly free or in control of our lives. On the contrary, we're always dependent on and at the mercy of our suffering. So we must eliminate the enemy that destroys anything which is wholesome or good, which is arrogance or pride. And we must do away with the evil attitude of belittling others and considering them as inferior.
That's not tripased Ani da Naja de Yona John Carrior Sedicalaya Yendala Tungchungda Mambabda Tendichange Tungchungda Mambabda Na Tik Jomiada Troyada Tendichagadi Jang Logis.
And so what's the fault? What's the problem with arrogance? So a person who's arrogant will look down upon others, will condescend others, will speak poorly of others, will, seek to defeat and, suppress others and so forth.
And that other thing also pay Carseota. Mutsu Munitani Pe Chana di Yavan, Dangaso Jacamdo, some Danson Otta, Casere de Zamberlini Chehu Nines, Go Karina, the Yenda, Casering in Matapa Mesamadao. Tendri Young and Jacamia Yori, Ming will some Danson. Ba nga yon tenche nga pamjo che nga namba ya nga chichi meti se pe tende shada sejini nga sota pe ta thamchi chi nga ja chenpo che shada ji hlab yoris te ina ta tada bene nga so chi nacha de chi hlab undu kala ani ta chi thamchi ta chi geya me ban ro chi be de korong ta thaphi de wo la ro me de cha gdu was te ko nga ja de so ya ma cha chi ni.
And so, we can think of this in terms of countries. There are a lot of countries who think that, they're the greatest, they're the most powerful, that they don't need anyone else, that there's nothing that they can't figure out for themselves. And then with individuals as well, they think, oh, I'm wealthy, I have good qualities, I have this Buddhist practice, I have this and that, I have whatever, I have a lot of money. And so, and then we get into this situation with this coronavirus, and no one can do anything about it. None of the things that they thought they had are of any use at this point, and they can't really do anything. And they are all, without any options. And so that really causes, that can cause our arrogance to be really cut down.
And then also be when trying get Jacob and somebody Zamberlin lot make a deep jalad to kapa tenche. And that's also Kambano Yanzi Zini de Redota. So charging in Jalu Termate, Kambano Yanzi de Redota, Takisimdua.
Jacob Shemba Toy Gdachi Kare?
Up in a Duten Sanjala Sobat, you get the Sotanjita, Sanja de Pa, Jendali Jabsan, Kate de Orede, Nalula de Nasajin Zoom, the Kambano Yatu in Korea Madu, Takima Chagados.
And so even countries, they can point all their big weapons at each other, but when it comes down to the actual individuals, all they can do is run inside and hide inside their houses because everyone's trying to restrict their, contact with people.
And then the James group, Tambo, the National Doing a Kajatire. Tang had Chirong Jen and Zamberlin at top serious, Tagayos. And it calls in a summer Tangi Pache Murray Tagados. Yes, Anna, Mumari Simburi take those. Zamberlin in top chief Murray, Mutata Zomit and Burry Chassis, you lie that I can't not do.
Bus in there, chick Nebudo, you say.
Oh, that name, but with you all.
And so when James Grubb first came here to the garden, I asked him, what do you think is the most powerful, living beings? The most powerful thing in the world? And he said, I think humans are probably the most powerful. And I said, I don't know. I think probably, this is a difficult thing to translate. He said actually bugs, but he means literally viruses and bacteria and stuff like that, because those are the things that kill humans. And humans, if they're the most powerful, and these are the things that kill humans, then they must be the most powerful.
Okay. And these are the Gangan Dungaji join and dig Susula Petexia. Tribatiama takes Chum Chagres.
And so when we meet with such suffering and such circumstances and suffering, then that can, really break down our arrogance. And so next is the fourth, which is using suffering to purify harmful actions.
Dungan the Tabatan, Dili Chi, Chiva Padmepan, Digba Bahibale Jung, Hibali, Nibata, Chi, Nibata, Perchibata, Mazibata, Mantebata, Ziba, Chumizaba, Yegone, Lepper, Samla, Teacher, said Dungan, Mandana, Yang, Te, Jim, Mageba, Punguso, Yamdan, Masata, Yegone, Yaki, Sama, then Dambalan Bedos.
Remind yourself and realize all the suffering which I'm going through, and suffering which is greater still, all the boundless suffering that there is, come from nothing but harmful negative actions. Reflect carefully and thoroughly how karma is certain, cause and effect is infallible. Karma multiplies enormously. You will never face the effects of something you have not done, and whatever you have done will not go to waste. Then say to yourself, so if I really don't want to suffer anymore, then I must give up the cause of suffering, which is negativity. And with the help of the four powers, make an effort to acknowledge and purify all the negative actions that you have accumulated in the past, and then firmly resolve to avoid doing them in the future.
So, and then the songs the leader said that so the thing and data number of shoot. And then the songs on Kalata. Chetang lead Jim Disi Yoreta, Jakan la Tanchini, Driving Jumuyavatita. That they yacht, that it's own the thing and of that Chagio number.
And so when we talk about karma, the Buddhists are the ones who talk, most about karma. And so when we talk about karma, what we're talking about is that, basically just that results come from causes.
And that Benaji Nasotada. Penata Susugulega Dukjaji Lebaina, Pena Messea la Sopa, Truba Jibella Sopa Chebaina, Te da Jajache. Any D gene is so solar Benetachi, Nuda la Sopa Carcham, Theatre de so, and in River Yach. Chetan Chinoquanda with the Indices.
So just a very general understanding of this is that if you do something bad, let's say you fight with someone or you killed someone, that becomes the cause, the result of whatever kind of problems and difficulties arise as a result of that.
And the Gana Jingeta Kalaji Society Jeche, Dragu Jayat in Jibna Wiche, the Gana Jin Leka Zambo Jeche, and in Diligent in Devaji Chunandela, and in Jeviche. Tendreda was that Tamchi Jimri Nili J. Devandawich. Jimri Nil engine Tangaso no to the trap Devandawich. Chetam de Yago.
And so similarly, because you eat some food and eating that food is the cause, then you get the result of having a filled up belly. Similarly, if you do some good action, then you'll have some kind of result, which is a result of some kind of happiness or comfort. And so basically it's just that everything, both our environment as well as all the living beings that live within that environment, all come about because of this process of cause and effect.
And that Tinuni Missegate young, the same Johnny Sager, that number they get Monchiva, the same Johnny Sager, Mixete. The Kari Yago City, same girl, gelatine, digging river day. Hajang Mambo Pengage. Pa Hajang Mambo Pendong. Mix a same corona de Yagyores.
And then in a more particular explanation from Buddhism, we talk about karma in relation to your mind. And so the way that we talk about that is that your mind or a state of your mind acts as a cause. And from that cause, there can be a much, much greater or many, many results and a much more powerful result, something which is bigger than the actual cause.
That tell tension, that need in tone, that this him the Getakonga courage in the Jainas, the Nepete zone of the Gala bed. Pansam Gelatani same on Mashum attended. Say, Mashum did not know a dalang sing, Tanu Shebanagi, Dala, and then you're the so much Mayabaton, Karina Chico, Dukashada Tonguich. That same piercing in the Tenida which Jijay in Percham which he ordered.
So our mind can also create something really big out of something else. So I give an example often of, I often give the example of, let's just say that someone gave me a bit of a dirty look today. And then in my mind, I start thinking about that and I get stuck on that. Why did they do that? And really get stuck in the cycle of thinking about that, the fact that they just gave me a dirty look. And at a certain point, I get to a point where I can't even take it anymore. And it doesn't, it's overwhelming me. And that gets to the point where before we were talking about how all appearances arise as our enemies. And at that point, we become so upset by this that no matter what we see, we're going to see in a negative light. We're going to see it as something that we don't want to see or something that upsets us. And so that's what I mean when I say that the mind can actually exaggerate or really make something really big out of something which started off as something very small.
아니 다 대전의 마치 제반 대전 마치 연바 여바디 키라이 자그라고 다 남비 이온디 다다 데리장 지만데 다롱양 디브 멍한다고지 제반 통도도 갈라 제반 차도도 에너지 냐비 나와 생긴다고 대소다돼서 냐와 생긴데 여기 때는 랑센스 마야바지 이 통초지고니 양도도 갈라 아니 냐비 나와 생긴다 야 셈바 정보를 땡지니 다 신강고 나와 생긴다고 다 덴데스 제지니 나위 통이 되는 거고요 다 델미세가 레이세 덴데지 약요.
And then not only, what happens in this life, but in Buddhism, we discuss and, posit the existence of past and future lives, of other lifetimes. And we say that, that the results that we sow, the causes that we sow in this lifetime will have results now, but have even greater results in the future. And so when we talk about these, other states of existence, like the perceptions of the hell realms and so forth, we're not talking about them in the context of a place or the objects that are in that place, but only as a level of perception. And so that's why we call it, the appearances or the perceptions of a hell realm. And so by doing a lot of negative actions, then you have this very negative level of perception. And so we're not talking about some kind of actual existing place. And we're talking about a way of seeing things or a way that things appear in your mind's eye or in your perception. And similarly, if you do a lot of positive actions and your mind is habituated to this wholesomeness, then we talk about the perceptions of the pure realms and so forth.
ngama yoba teso yang meba chaya dang ani tati gi ji kanga teso tamji yang ta shakwa la soba mebi goni ani pentu ji jungko za ani ndana te ya yabres.
So as a result of various types of difficulties, then la yanje shi sunanda
tata dwala chi kasiri di dikpa jangwa se hede jimidela ta degi inge ta kasiri di dunga la gawa singe ta tinu robu horwa ta deji ko dikpa de tene jang do yo ta ko kanga del tenchi ni dikpa jangya la soba tene inza.
And so this is also kind of almost like a level of, or an aspect of, being a way that we can rejoice in or be happy about the suffering that we can. And the reason is because as a result of the suffering, our past negativities are becoming, exhausted or becoming abandoned. And that also we can use this circumstance right now to make us reflect on, and then all the negativity that we have done, and use that as a cause to kind of overcome through the practice of, confession, acknowledgement, and purification. We can acknowledge and purify all the negative actions that we have done in the past by considering the situation that we're in right now, that it is a result of negative actions of the past.
Okay, so I'm going
to continue on here.
Gevala gawana dunga lupi devala gana ti je gevala begusu nyam de jiba samna gotma ni give it so temperature.
So the next is using suffering to find joy in positive action. So say to yourself, if you really want to find happiness, which is the opposite of suffering, if I really want to find happiness, which is the opposite of suffering, then I've got to make an effort to practice its cause, which is positive action. Think about this in detail from every angle and dwell in the implications. Then in every way possible, do whatever you can to make your positive beneficial actions increase.
So tadi jom den dige jelam ko pa khain ba gedung chimin dige song song tadi drive de la drive de ndako na di jetraps drive de ndako na di jakas jela ne chi thugure ma ton drive kapsala tene kale khobore song re ta te song yor dana.
So the Buddha said that, if you want to do something about, suffering, for example, you need to stop it from the cause. And similarly, if you want to attain happiness, then you need to develop the causes of happiness. Once the result is already there, there's nothing you can really do about it. So you need to stop suffering from the cause of suffering. You need to stop its causes from happening so that the result can never come into existence in the first place. And if you want to accomplish happiness, then you need to sow the seeds for happiness. You need to actually practice the causes for it.
And the be chanda with Java in Anta, so peggy Nuda de la Gagmena, and Tambo de Pagila Chick, Je Merchik Dunya Dang, say alas about the Chejo Mares. The Majina Uncle Nuda the Yungu Mare. The Jets had the Kala and Nuda the Younger racing in that.
Like, for example, if you don't want to have a bunch of problems, then, don't fight with people, don't beat people, and then you won't have to experience the problems that arise because you've done such things. That's just an example then.
So, the day that was it. I got changed. Didn't know here there, get a rage, but I so Dunga Lamcher said the Galaya, Dunga de Annie. Kensanda which JJ. Then daily any same getty Ramatelaya, Peria, Ramatelaya and Royak. The Dindi Songa and in the Dunga Lamchers.
So again, to go back, when we're talking about taking suffering on the path, then we're taking suffering as a step, as a stair in our set of stairs, where we are using those stairs as a way to develop and increase our qualities of mind or our levels of our mind.
Tan dodo which divaina, ane, ta kangan de la tenjeni, ane, Jung ta dugjung da wachirang, lima sombache, ti kangan del tenjeni, sem gipagi yanten ya, chimper checheni, maungba kangan de rang ne matabachi ta yong tabachi ta zevi ta heba hejinda with teres.
And so what's primarily being discussed here in brief is that when we experience these kind of difficulties, that we shouldn't just incur a loss from that. We shouldn't just be harmed by that, but that we should be able to rely upon that suffering situation in order to increase the qualities and the power of our mind such that in the future, these kind of difficult circumstances won't be able to harm us.
Hola, so ante that dieta de so casereta lo jung data lo jung sedita lo jung dieta de so ta manchewa de tambo nilo de hiwache. And then there were young say so good the Hakwa Chechini, any La Lenta, did it any Kali Sam de Pa, Com Jenny. And it's also same day, days one Tabanda was zone Bichani, and indeed that Lamches and under Lojungs and under all this Chakiodis.
So this is these types of practices are what we call mind training techniques. And so they're called mind training. So first you have to understand the situation of your mind. And then once you know that, then you take these types of, practices and you continue putting them into practice until you become very familiar with them, until they become, part of your habituation. And it comes to a point where you really gain power over your mind in these kind of circumstances. And it's from that perspective that we call it mind training, because you have to continue habituating yourself, familiarizing yourself, putting this into practice again and again, training yourself. And so that's why we call that, this practice of taking something on the path, taking suffering on the path as an aspect or a practice of mind training.
Okay, James. Ahora so, ani deche, teni da che number di, ta che tang ge che ta di jang du kam da uchi mai na, ore ta tring aso di gomya ko de te si sia te se de kamu chasuma.
No.
De ta gomya ko de te is tring kale khabu do chasung. Then Dino and the train this he and diggy any cassidy, Jetang gom magivagata, pentum the petchemoy, thing around rangetini, so the haku years.
And so again, today we don't have much time to get into any kind of actual meditation, but the point and part of the benefit of this practice that I know from my own experience is that this type of mind training practice is the kind of thing that you can get a lot of benefit from. Which is a practice that doesn't require meditation. Just by understanding and familiarizing yourself with these ideas, you get a lot of benefit from that.
아니 다 드레인 베치 넘바게다 디 가르낭고레세나 다 쪼번 냠낸다고 지 넘바이나 아니 나서 그 파기 강한다 나라니 그 발라 근데 지네 샘데 코마 되겠지 샘데 yen다라 파 딜이 타링 와지 판로트 받제 고레스.
And so the main thing that I want you to do here, if you want to work on some kind of practice coming from these teachings, is to not allow your mind in the problem that we're in to stay stuck and circling around each other. Don't just get stuck in this cycle of being stuck in this problem, but allow your mind to separate itself from the problem, to send it to some other object of focus.
다 yendalan rotondo pena tatana ngasodna ninjido chi ta gombaina ane sosoma lele chi decheche ta tari chi kanganda ne tongde so tanjela pha ta che undukala tani lele chini chori meba chini yaundukala ane tata ngarang ne chowa ngarang ne dowa hale mambuyore deje trade sola ताचिने फा निंजे चे याबाइना निंजे चे देले दोंगाले या ट्रांदो रावो चे चे ओबाइना ते दु सेम दे दना खोय माता सेम दे जाबलु रो सारेस खोलोनो खोय माता बा जाबलु रो सारेस तिगे लोयां चे छागरेस.
And so the way that we can bring our mind out of that cycle, the way that we can send it to something else, is by practicing compassion. And so the way that we'll do that is by sitting and relaxing your mind. And then allow yourself just to be aware of this situation, aware of this difficult situation that we're all in. And just look at it with a relaxed and unbiased mind. And then consider how many people have it off worse than you. How many people's situation is worse than you? How many people are suffering more than you? And how many incredible amount of people are suffering more than you and in a more difficult situation than you. And turning your attention to them, then you can generate compassion. And compassion is the mind which wishes them to be freed from that suffering. So if you can, think of them, think of these people, and then wish them to be freed from suffering, that's a way that, in that way, your mind has moved outside of that situation of considering your own suffering or considering your own situation. It has jumped outside of that. It's moved out of that cycle and has, become unstuck from that situation, and can really get into a state of, relaxed spaciousness.
아니야, 내가 나인 게지 잠로다 남준도 붙이네 지 남바지는 걸 잠로지 제제 아니 막공 그래. 아니 근데 손잔다 지 가세한 거디 동안 접제겠다 파기 맹한다고 돼서 제제. 아니 되게 가세한 거다 지 소속의 생파 접제겠다 맹한다 돼서야 트레온도 갈라 다디 람양다 렌도도 문도 데 소속이 깨바지지 소소라데 팽해도에 문도지 따지 그렇발 아니 근데 제제니 다 때문에 양다더지 이나 오타문이 되게 다 접투도 더 삼지니 다디 희행에 대야 때문에 가자대 쳐버지지래도 코 만너바지래샤 삼네 근데 야 되게지 가와다 트로와다 대바다 근데제 용그레스.
And so if you're a Buddhist practicing this, then you should start by, reciting some words of refuge and then move into the practice. But anyway, as you're practicing this, you should think, as you're thinking, considering this text, you should, think over these instructions and think about whether you think this is an authentic path or not, whether you think this is useful or not, whether you think that you're going to be benefited by this or not. And if you think it is, and you think it is able to somehow protect you or somehow, benefit you, and if you think that the person explaining this to you is unmistaken and is speaking in an authentic manner and in a beneficial manner, then you can really generate some real enthusiasm for the practice and some real trust or faith in the practice.
Ndindrabigita semjeng kangan dunga den tong tela semma zebe checheni ta maumba getni semjeng de zo nge ndindrabi semjeng de zo dunga chathoba jinge zogi sebe tamja 당부 제발 때니 아니 타도 리버 마태는 거 받을래야 담자 들리 마땅 받지 로야 버래 Dena yin jeni ngaso darida je maungba ge semjen de ji yungu yebe de nge ge ji petu ji zogi sambi tamja ji jeni rona de yang be yagu yores.
And then, in Buddhism, we talk about other Buddhas, such as the medicine Buddha. And so the medicine Buddha, saw a situation such as the one that we're in, a pandemic type situation. And his mind was just like, couldn't tolerate the suffering. And it was from that type of experience that, that the medicine Buddha made prior to their Buddhahood, made a commitment to be able to protect sentient beings in the future from such circumstances. And that was their way of generating, their mind of enlightenment, that was their commitment that they held all the way up until the point that they attained enlightenment, from the beginning of their path until they attained enlightenment. And so for us as well, when we see this kind of situation, if we can think that, if we can make our own kind of mental commitment that we are going to practice such that we will be able to be a protector for beings in the future, if there, a situation such as this arises again in the future, that we could be someone who could actually offer them refuge, someone who could protect them in the future. And so that would also be a good way to contemplate this.
다 제나바베 다 인제돼서 히다 빼야고 여러봐. 안 근데 손자다 대상게 되더나 문이 다니다 뭐 야고 망보지 다 못하는 것도. 할래야 그 문이 다니다 가동이야 나도 아직 벽에 신행다 배바 초당에 대시에 되고 봐. 다 할래야 그 배샤몽 방지 다 멍멍다. 할래야 그 루바 할래야 그 직진 다뭐 야고 돼서 문이 닫아 타는 것도. 다 대손더버진 통운디가라 아치 운이다니지 몽바라 나양 든더버지 제게인다 든더버지 용어쇼 더버지 쌈네 감자지 지네 대배야고도 왔어.
And also, you guys all speak English here, so you understand all the situation in the world. But for me, I just have to hear about this from other people. Like I'm in contact with other Tibetans and so forth who tell me about this stuff. But these days, a lot of good people are kind of showing themselves. It's bringing out the best in people. And so, a lot of people who are able to offer help and, wealthy people who are able to, make a lot of generous donations are revealing themselves in the world. And so it's also, really good if we can think, make a commitment that I'm also going to do that in the future, or kind of pray, may I also be able to be of that kind of benefit? May I also be able to work in that same way in the future? And if we make that kind of an aspiration, that's also really good.
아니 가면 나라 시행했는데야 못돼 주도 다 대상 가서 지금 잠벌래야 뭐 누가 된대랑 야 쇼치 뭐 뭐를 탄데도 쓰라고도 다 빼는 다단지 송 당선 다뭐 약보돼서 다 가만도 다 가서 배 윤이 통고도.
And so, in the past, I've had people tell me that, like, it's only the worst people that we ever, see revealing themselves in the world, that we actually notice in the world. But now in this current situation, we see, a lot of really good people. We actually see a lot of good people kind of showing their faces in the world.
That's what the soul tension when GC singing the chat. And it tender was so jet to a manager. Then this Jenaya so somebody pay religion pa in robberies.
And so if we can see their example and rejoice in their wholesome actions, and also aspire for ourselves to be able to, commit or to work towards similar, actions that we're rejoicing in, then that will really bring us a lot of tranquility to our minds.
Okay,
so we're going to go through some questions here. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. James, do you have questions? I don't know. We don't.
Because it was unclear this morning. So just to let people know, if you have a question, it's in the Q&A area, and you can put your question in there. And I don't have the questions from this morning. So if you had a question from this morning and you still want to ask it, you can put it in there. So
I'm going to answer one of the questions from this morning, because someone asked, can Khen Rinpoche speak more about the secret obstacles and how to overcome them? And I think that's going to come later in the text, in the discussion about working with happiness and suffering from the ultimate standpoint. And, that's going to be addressed. Khen Rinpoche shokin ne anchi ngazo gedachik chinang sangsung gedachik parche den chik soim.
This is so much song jana la pe abudu.
Mare de wachi yore digitoni.
아
Chig Yanchik Sangway Barchi, then she Seltang, the Zogitone Chik Sungi and Besa.
알레라서 당가서지 거기다 상위 받치 세대에 제된다고 지랬다 아 소수파기 샘게 나눠라다 아 점바 다 다든 점바라고지 데 애니 당가서디 우니 장내게다 지 강가 탐지 용사기 현라고 됐어데 데레 데 애니 파세 송아이나 데니 세다 낭세 딩이 되게다돼서 코랑징게 데니 팔라도 요레스
이게 안직 세당 디 카레라.
다디 세당 로부디 다 제당게 마기 산이다 던덤 급되나 마슬고 것도 라발라 다다 던덤 kople 마시 온도 안데 송자 토멀 제가세레 다메 바나오치 다딘도에면도 데고 마텔 팝체지니 소소그 로이 파기디 타쳐바지 조지니 드르시온도 다데 문이 더라 트고 요마레 파 로이 야야바나오치 그 가체인데 지 즈바지를 통두고 요래 근데 송자한테는 디 즈바데 파 근데 디 르르 그래스 그 가세를 다메기 더는 통소나 아니 즈바데 랑기 파 르르 요래스 아디 세동다 어디 쪼고 드레스
And so the secret obstacles are primarily that grasping at the self. And, that grasping at the self is really the source. It's really the foundation of all of our other difficulties. And the way that, and when that grasping at the self is cleared up, that secret obstacle, when that is cleared away, then all of the inner and outer obstacles just fall by the wayside. They are automatically eliminated. And the way that they are eliminated is going to be discussed later in the explanation on the perspective of this happiness and suffering from the relative or from the ultimate truth. Right now, we're speaking in terms of the relative truth. But generally speaking, the way that goes then is that you investigate whether the self exists or not. And you go through this practice of investigating. And when you come to the conclusion that the self doesn't truly exist, that it is merely an imputation of the mind, and that it merely comes down to our level of grasping. And then that grasping can be released. And so when you see the truth of selflessness, then the grasping at the self naturally just dissipates. And so that's the way of overcoming these secret obstacles. But that's going to come up, further in detail.
아니 가세레 파기 다 마렉바데 탐지 좀니 라바타 다다 즈바세 딩에서 다 통닌 징디 거라바 디 시르고 톱지고니 즈바데서 좀도 디갑라 아니 dig 나서 바치 세그레스.
And so these obstacles then are eliminated by the power of our wisdom. That is our, profound level of intelligence. And it's through that we overcome our ignorance. And that ignorance is that, that grasping itself. And so by using that discriminating awareness and that wisdom, then that's the way that we overcome the grasping. That's the way that we defeat the grasping.
So we have a question from Nick. When we say working with outer obstacles, does this mean changing our environment and external conditions to get rid of this source of suffering?
Khen Rinpoche Ngawang Gelek chi barche den so le anchik donglen che atang degi anchik thapse rawchik de degi donda rawchik Ngawang Gelek o sacha shemba rawchik la poche yang mena de chi chen den so pa yuk chen ni anchik de le teni den chik dunge pango chu rawchik yang barche set chu rawchik den de besa
da tele ni dos ta le tangbo ba ina ani yor de da tes rains ndo na ya ba yores ani tes nyamle ge ten cha ji thaba yin ba ina tene ko yor da nyam de che che ni ani ka se tendes che nyam de na yam le ba chi cha do gres de de kala tene jang rain go ya kan yo mares.
So there's kind of two aspects to that. 아니 되게 안직 남중기 바체도 치세고레데
다츠게 직다 유진게 차진 만종비게 차진 만종바다 차진 독자 태비게 다진 독자 태 되려라 이 젠데 저르세죠 말에
that's
당가서 추게 잡는 데니 젠데 저르세니 주시고라 발라 젠이 둘도야 직다 젠왕데 왕데 존도야 지니요라 바다 어떻게지 렌 잡잖아
또 연주 직송난다
앞에는 젠을 저르세용도 다 파기라 차진 독자지 나솔 템드라고 지 독자 다 템드세고 말에 다지 문팀바 냐 람드는 태용한다고 다 젠에 맞해야다 근데 중두가라 아니 다 소소라다 냠내게 혁첨 메나 아니 다 데일리 데이스 파 장레인스라고 지제나 팽게레 데이스 말 다 소소를 냠내지 여바이나 아니 간 여마스코 제 독자지나 코데 여여카레 내가 랑라코 소시셈데 많통나 냠데 때잖아 다른 야바요레스.
And so there's kind of two sides to that answer. And so from one perspective, then as it's kind of the way that you were saying, as a beginner in the practice, then if you're experiencing these outer difficulties, outer obstacles, then it is better to distance yourself from the source of those obstacles. But once you have progressed more, once you have developed yourself more, then there's actually nothing to be disturbed by, and actually just only things to be gained by actually engaging with or being in the midst of those difficulties and outer obstacles. And so there's kind of 2 points to that.
And did no la shedu da de cheni di smart de she so dongan la magawa meba magawa mjia te don dongan la taron gawa gom se de di no la tere ko chen de pawang de jor ya yor tere.
And so but in this text it's discussing this from the perspective of the second, which is actually to not allow the outer conditions to overpower you, but for you to actually control the situation by not allowing yourself to feel displeasure or aversion to unfortunate circumstances, and to actually generate a joy at the meeting with adverse circumstances, which means that you are taking control of the situation instead of being controlled by the situation.
Ani phagin rupa ge chibache an khong la sha 나서 천농의 지집에 스밍이 말이벨라 이 장도 갈라 천농의 장고래다 마도 사칼 되니 장야요 말다스.
So like one Bhutanese Dharma practitioner was talking about swimming, and he said you got to learn swimming in the water, you can't learn swimming from the dry ground.
타고 천농의 만즈 아니 카다 맥다 나데서 노는 천즈 고 깔리 중거를 되는 고 장고도 장니 반산 천농의 자카타고도 어디나 예진이 텍스 냠내 용의 제나 고 강강노의 양자 파효 제니 아니 디노는 야 자카탑로고요 다가 베네 자가가 톱톱돼서 된다고 지래.
And so it's like when you're learning to swim, you have to jump in the water, get water in your ears, water in your eyes, water in your nose, and then you learn to swim and you gain mastery over or victory over the water in a sense. Similarly, once you have developed yourself a bit, then you should go into the midst of difficult circumstances, and then through that practice you can gain victory over outer circumstance, over adversity. And so that was the path of practice of most of the accomplished masters of ancient India.
Yeah. And 배우기 치바서 된데 멍보래 뺐다 그런지 사샤 된데 강강여서 그런 판로 제전되니 된데 냠내 나한테 요래.
There are also many Tibetan practitioners who practice in the same way, that they actually go directly into, places. They actually seek out and go directly into places that have a lot of disturbance and difficulties in order to practice.
Yeah.
So I just want to say something. So I'm looking at some of the questions. So we have all levels of people here, people who really know a lot about Buddhism and people who don't. So some of these questions are in the context of people who know a lot about Buddhism, like the Yogacara breakdown of the 8 senses. So I don't know, Justin, how Khen Rinpoche wants to deal with that.
Well, anyway, just ask the question. He can choose to answer it or not. It doesn't matter. We have
great. That's perfect.
Khen Rinpoche chegian dakshin jewa ge dachi ningje gomya layanchi dakshin jewa ge nyamlan de tis sono nasa.
Ahora so ani ta di phagi lo jung ta tikchen lo jung nang lo la ya ta je dong de la rba ta xie on de kala nyam sing ji da je se chi nyam ba ta ya ji dong nga le la ba phaju de la ta ya chi ta ni la de meng ta yo res.
And so someone asked, can you explain the practice of exchanging oneself for others to practice compassion? And so in the Mahayana, the great vehicle mind training stages of practice, we have 2 aspects to this. First is equalizing self and other. Second is actually, considering others, more than yourself. That is the moving into the practice of exchanging self and other.
Rang lula pe long ni yen ne ba ma ji ji se na ji rang la khang ji ga hi gare no do gare ji ji do te ha ko che te da pha ju me ni me yin ba la ji ba ta ko zu bu kha re ma do cho ba ye ba la ji ba do chi ta che che ni ta ya de ga chen mo do zi yo de.
And so it's considered to be important that first we take our own body, our own experience as an example to think of that whatever we like, whatever is harmful to us, whatever is pleasant to us, that we can understand that even though the other person is different, they have a different body, they're the same in having feelings, and that things that are harmful to us will be harmful to them. We understand that we are equal in that.
Ta mele je che chung yore namba zang yore thap che chung yore ko sa che chung yore de je na me khoro ji ba re do de ha ko ya da ji.
And so even though there is inequality or difference in terms of finance, status, looks, position, whatever, generally speaking, we're all equal. That's what we're talking about.
Ta de shi chadi kabla te se kom go magom na ngaso ka se nga ma den do chi ngarang zo do chi de ma to mere wa da disong de te kom go re de la da yin nyam ba se de do chi te yang ja zhen hi yo de go hi yo de.
And so once you have understood that, you actually need to meditate on that equality of self and other, because before we're not habituated to that. We're not familiarized with that. We're only familiarized with or habituated to thinking of our own situation. So it's something that we actually have to develop first. The equality of self and other, we have to develop through meditation first.
Ani pöla de gongbo se ji da sa cha chi. Ani dada nga so phagi yang ne shola ani gongbo ne ya lung ne dada da khorang ji chiba da wo ji re chiba so do ji de nge khorang main la gongbo se de gi re. Ani khong da na pöla jo de kala pöla de kala ani nya sin ya dada di ji min de la cha ki de. Ani ko nya ji sin sam ji ni de ko cha ki de le de do ko de ko ba da ju ni che go ni ji he de do ko. Koran te is karanda china semba te is yinge zo do de che tendi che gala chakje de koran khan non zu mi pa non zu ta de ko de ga nawa re da ko nawa de ne thor so re ta de ya ma la shu ji nyang se do ko tendi da de le tendi ko lang so ni da wo ji senge zo do de che pe ma se tra nang shu ji cha song se ani ko lang so de so chama do dong jin chama me ba tang ya yin se ko de ji se gi do ta din do ji cha bre da.
So there's a guy from Tibet from Kong Sacha Kombo Nirwala.
Oh, re sacha de Kombo ni la da Quran me la Kombo se de da.
So there's a guy from the region in Tibet called Kombo who I met in Parping. He was a Dharma practitioner, and everyone just called him Kongbo because he was from Kongbo. So anyway, saying back in Tibet, he was thinking about going fishing. So he started trying to, make himself a fishing hook. So he's sitting there making a fishing hook, and they kind of drifted off into some kind of distraction. And then he thought, like in his mind, it appeared to him that he had actually swallowed the hook. And he was just like really terrified, really suffering that he couldn't get the hook out of his own mouth or his own throat. And it didn't actually happen. It was just like a weird perception that he had, a weird kind of daydream that he had. And then he immediately, as he kind of awoke from that, kind of weird perception that he had, he immediately took the hook he'd been making and smashed it to pieces and destroyed it. And so it's kind of like that, once you've seen that for yourself, then you'll see that for others.
할래야 닌지 흉침보지 젠도디갈라 테네지 나레 파디데 자체반다고 차송하지 델렛스기 오르다.
And so some people, when they develop that equalizing or equality of self and other to a strong degree, they develop a very strong level of compassion, which actually sees the other as with more concern than for themselves.
다 배능아서 등상다 하고도아. 다 등상 카시라 운이다니 소소를 배데 나차데 푸여바이나 양 다롱양 배디 야기니 어디 나라 나차데지 정송세 아니 추농송 노동데 제고도세니 그 강반노야 야주게데 야기니 마 텔레폰노나 배디가세레 시 아니 디테스 다송의 양자파 멘강노 레갈이 중에 다 나라야 된다고 운이 카시지 톡소 다 된다고 온다지 된데 다 대소 운이다니 달레지 예지바존도
So we can really see, even these days, we can see specific examples of people who develop that level of mind. Like there are people who I know, personally, who have gotten this illness, the coronavirus. And even after they've gotten it, they're laying there like sick in bed, still trying like through the phone and through, various techniques, trying to communicate, how other people need to take care of the symptoms that they're experiencing, trying to like really trying to help other people to prevent, having any situations with that. And then even after, I've even met some who got sick in the hospital through working in a hospital, even after they recovered, they go back to work in the hospital. And so we can really see this as examples people who have developed that sense of cherishing others even more than themselves.
Oh, so. Then this shit, then it down the Namjun Paji Amadeus on the Wachina, that's meaning around the Puguzachi and the Cheding Amapemambuyores.
And even just generally speaking, there are a lot of mothers in the world, who are able to have that level of having even more concern for their child than they have for themselves.
That then the water Nambagan Tambo Ninja Longje, and Ninja the Tang Jenny, and a Pansam Tiladini, that Semje Yendala Ropache, Takachi, Nibanda with the Dembaji Sohyor, Tatere, it Dajin Nyambani, Jeva said it. Daily, then Dali Yenchi singing that Yambaji look your, then this Jenita Yunkiors.
And so, that's the way that in Buddhism we develop this compassion. And so we develop it that at a certain sense, what we're doing then is developing the capacity to actually help others, a real power within ourselves. And we develop that through this process of equalizing ourselves and then putting ourselves in the other's situation, exchanging self and others. And then eventually we get to the point where we actually have that full-blown, development of power where we do see others as with more concern than we actually see ourselves, or we cherish others more than ourselves.
Oh, so and then it's on that our Nyamba Sedukala, Tendi Chiparendue, Mendo Samo Tandi, Chebache, Gomche, Tendi Genetics and Rose, Gomtes Jekos.
And so first in that equalizing, you need to do some kind of analytic meditation, seeing if you are in fact, if you and others actually are the same in that sense that we discussed.
And in the Dayen, Jeva Seundukala, Teni, Ogutala Jenny. And so la jita, Casere Devata, Gawata, Chipa Kanya, but so long la Jenny, Pa Simje Tamjela Thompson, some Jenny Pa Tangche. And Pagi Simjang ne Nata Kanga Karina, the Sotamji, Ogna, Pojela, Denning, Aranga Thompson, some Jenny, the Jenny, Wog Pando Sendola Jerchini, the Des Jenny, Jehi or the taste of Devayori.
And then de Untitled Dene Tonglan Tante Dakshin Jewa the Chiparwala.
Ore dajen jewa la rela. Dajen jewa gomdi wole gomji te tere.
Oh, re de Untitled Dakshin Jewa Tan Tonglan Ginyamlan de Chiparavela.
Rela. Oh, tadi kasi nyamle che tong rabote tonglen goni che gore wala.
And so the way that we put this exchanging self and others into practice is through the practice of giving and taking, this Tonglen practice. So what we do is we imagine that all of our, virtue, all of our wholesome goodness, happiness, and so forth, goes out from us with our breath as white light and goes out and dissolves into all of those beings. And we imagine that they have actually attained that, happiness and virtue and so forth. And then we imagine that all of their sickness, all of their suffering and so forth, all comes out from them in black smoke, black light, and comes and dissolves with our in-breath into us. And we practice in that way, giving and taking, happiness and suffering.
No, la so. Ani tendes che oreta, re tendes che. Ani, ta pa je lu jewa de ta thupo ne mena ta lu jewa se undu phaju me kanga yonge che te phata wa ta ba mai bache phagi ge lu de ngarang lu le phajor dendes che ne phagi lu de ngarang che jor che ne ani di kidong da wo nyoya chi ta de che yore.
And then there's another practice in connection with that where we see someone who is in a difficult situation, experiencing some kind of suffering, and we actually imagine exchanging our bodies with them. We actually put ourselves in their situation directly. And that's another type of practice also with the exchanging self and other.
Anita dali yenchi gongona, ta kandaji gongu yoriseti ta ngaso ki yendala semje mambo chi pena ta tari ngaso chi zambelen kanga chimbo chi duwa. Ten dawo chi thamji dani da chop thamge chi chunga ina ta ngarang chi lute ina ya te yagi inda chi. Tendes chi ne ta lu lungcho kari ina ngarang pe chop thamge chi chunga nge te yagi inda chi samne seng thamja dawo song chi ne. Te yangcha traine ta luda te yin lungcho ta te song gi ngo bona senje kunje tendo to phwa me ba tangwa sa se. Tende wala.
And so the way that we practice then cherishing others more than ourselves is that we train ourselves. We make a commitment, that if we could protect others from suffering, like this kind of suffering that we are in right now, that we would even give up our bodies, our possessions, our wealth, everything that we have, we would give that up. And we make a commitment that I would give it up if I could protect all these beings from suffering. And you familiarize yourself with that commitment again and again.
Anta pechana tijana ngi zupo tela. Tseri bache labjina. Ta churong zupo digi nantana. Ta kasere di nasa dele penze ge zijindus. Ta di kasi chunga ina ane ta ki kasere tamal ta pen ta tupsa rese na. Ane pache ji ngarang lute ya ngarang lutang du yange soro. Ta pen rabu yana tendere.
La.
Ta pe yana tendere. Ta penge ta chi pen tobya ge churong zupo dele chi zijindu se na. Reba. Oh, digre ni kase zupo de ta kasere ta peje ngadi chi ni zupo zi kare na de taggings ta ngarang pen ta ngarang te do wala.
So it's like, we could say an example like that if a doctor said that there is some substance that your body is, and that could actually cure everyone of illness. That, you're basically saying, okay, if my body could cure everyone, then I will give up my body in order to be a cure for everyone. That's an example of what we're talking about here.
Okay.
And so first we need to do and don't think about the actual implementation of that at first, but just think of this as a mental exercise.
And
so at a certain point, if we do train ourselves intensively in these types of practices, it could come to a point where if the situation arose, we could actually, give that up without any sense of regret. But up until we attain that type of power, then we need to keep and protect our bodies. We need to maintain, sustain, and protect our bodies.
Okay.
Laso tutu simsa son la.
Laso Lasso and that to che, then that the Vala Taroma here and what it takes in do, and the Jima Gazanima decalare, and decalange de Marshie, you the Yamdela, and a young children soon get the Lojun de some my Begiaje. She need a wugong to get the name, and then make she need corner we are tasty here.
And so that's all the time we have for today. And, we're going to continue. There's still more to explain in this text, and we're going to proceed with that next Sunday. And for those of you who, in addition to just going through these mind training techniques, want to also, put some kind of meditative practice into practice, then I'm also going to talk a little bit about calm abiding meditation next Sunday.
Kashi Nyamle pay up with the Yajere. That is on the Virginia, Jido Lamcher. The so Kapsala Pene, Chipoina, Dupoina, the so Tamche, any chick, ta, Kasere, chick, Custom Jingo, ni Johnny, Gomet and Yore, and the so Tamche, chick, Shidi Yore, and it did what you gom and degrees.
And then for those of you, I know there are some of you who are at much, quite advanced levels of your practice. And that chidu den so kusum de joya.
Ore chipoyang kasere dene kusum chugulong tukusum journey dene gom dang de yorela.
And so anyway, I know that a lot of you are on higher levels of meditation, and you already know some other practices, such as this practice of, whenever happiness or suffering arises, that you can actually transform that experience of happiness or suffering into the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, and so forth. So if you know those practices, you should do those practices as well.
Ani tendedo maina ani nge tari heba na yin cheni that chik pe pentu chembo yore nge tari heba gomdong chi he so de danda u ji jeba ina pe pentu chembo yore chudong so de sam tangs.
Tari kusumde.
Kusum mainba yemba la. Dangé Taripe Ninja Gomdong Taji Asiri GC around Jedong to Hima Soela.
No.
Not to hit at this.
And so then for everyone else, then all of these, methods that I was giving before are really beneficial, and we should put them into practice, such as developing compassion for others, rejoicing in the good deeds of others, and so forth. And we should be trying to put those into practice.
Lasso Nta Chenamba Pe Chikasere. Teni ta ore ta tinang train the Tugusanga Rinpoche Gita Nama Kong Pe Chidok Chik Drong Jering it and I Shakotan so that train Mason a Jimatical Shiki. Then that's in about some Kibo shows.
And so I was going to tell a story today of Tukusanga Rinpoche in connection with this practice of happiness and suffering, but I didn't get time. So anyway, I wish you all happiness.
Okay, yeah. Just a quick announcement. I know there was other questions by Alex, William, and Colleen. I wrote them down, and we can begin with those next time. And we will have the same time next Sunday, and it's the same link to access it. And if there's any feedback or questions about the webinar, you can write me personally at the email I sent out, james@ewamshedra.org. And that's all I have to say.
How do you say? Is it done?
Thank you, Khen Rinpoche. Thank you, Justin.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Everyone.